I could hear the familiar weight in my father's voice before he even spoke. It was the tone that meant something was about to change, something big, something that would rip through the fabric of the life we'd built and leave us all tangled in its wake. "You should sit down for this," he said, adjusting his glasses in that way he always did when he was about to deliver bad news. The kind of news you couldn't escape, no matter how much you tried to prepare for it. I was already seated at the long, polished dining table, the one that had been in our family for generations. The heavy oak table, with its intricate carvings, bore the marks of countless family dinners, discussions, and debates, a history etched into the wood. The room smelled faintly of aged leather and rich mahogany, a scent that brought back memories of Sunday evenings spent under the warm glow of candlelight. Surrounded by the clatter of plates and the hum of family chatter, it was a place where everything felt permanent, like nothing would ever truly change. But change was coming. I could feel it, settling like a cold draft in the air. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I knew this moment was inevitable. After all, I was 35 years old. I had spent the better part of my adult life building something for myself, something substantial. But somehow, here I was, sitting at this table, still waiting for my parents to see me for who I had become, rather than who they wanted me to be. My name is Catherine Evans, I thought, half as a reminder to myself, half as a grounding point in this whirlwind of emotions. And today, I was about to find out just how little my parents truly understood me. The estate had been in our family for 4 generations. The sprawling Victorian mansion stood tall in the distance, its wraparound porch casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. The meticulously manicured gardens seemed to breathe life into the place, as if the grounds themselves were a testament to the pride of the family who'd tended them for years. To anyone on the outside, it was a picture-perfect legacy. But to me, it was more than just a house. It was a piece of my soul, my childhood, my dreams for the future, the place where I had imagined raising my own family, just as my parents had raised me. "Your mother and I have been discussing the estate's future," my father said, his voice laced with a strange hesitation. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses again, the nervous tick a sign that something wasn't right. "We've decided that it's best if it goes to Thomas." My younger brother, Thomas Evans, 3 years my junior, had never cared much for the estate. To him, it was just a tool to be used when he needed something. The few times he had shown interest in the property had been when he was looking for collateral to back his latest failed business venture. I could already feel the tension building in my chest. A life built on reckless decisions and empty promises, yet somehow, my parents had always found a way to cover for him, to bail him out. Meanwhile, my life, my work, had been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in their eyes. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers lightly grazing the edge of my glass. I kept my face carefully neutral, hiding the sting of their words. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steady but hollow. A sip of water gave me a moment to gather my thoughts, to mask whatever emotion flickered across my face. My father's eyes never left me, but his expression remained unreadable, as if he was waiting for me to react. "It's for the best, dear," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with that same false sweetness that had been present since I was a child. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine, an attempt to comfort me in the way only she knew how. I could feel her gaze, warm and pleading, but it wasn't enough. Her hand was soft, but it was the kind of touch that felt distant, as if it were meant to console someone else. I moved my hand away before she could touch it, placing it firmly in my lap, out of reach. The sudden coldness between us was unmistakable, but I refused to pretend otherwise. "Michael has such grand plans for the estate," she continued, her voice now tinted with the kind of reassurance that made my skin crawl. "And you've always been so busy with your little real estate projects." Little real estate projects. That's what she called the empire I'd painstakingly built. 10 years of meticulous planning, of carefully orchestrated deals, and they reduced it all to something trivial, something beneath them. My blood boiled at the thought, but I kept my cool. My years of business dealings had prepared me for moments like this. I'd spent so much time perfecting the art of staying calm under pressure, of masking my true feelings. But inside, I was seething. I thought about the properties I had purchased across 3 states, the developments that were now worth more than this entire estate could ever be, how they had no idea how far I had come, how much I had built while they turned their blind eyes to everything I had worked for. Thomas knows the importance of family tradition, my father continued, his voice gaining confidence, as if he were trying to convince me of something I already knew to be untrue. He'll preserve the estate exactly as it should be. I was choking on the irony of it all. Thomas, with his failed schemes and empty promises, was somehow the better candidate? I could already see the ridiculous plans he'd make for the estate, turning it into some tourist trap or making the garden a putting green, as though that would somehow preserve its legacy. I took another sip of water, allowing the coolness to settle my nerves. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much for this. And now, just like that, they were handing it over to someone who didn't care for it, someone who would destroy everything this estate represented. "When did you make this decision?" I asked, my voice calm, though my insides were anything but. The question hung in the air, and I could feel my father's hesitation. "We've been thinking about it for some time," my mother said, looking down at her hands in her lap. "Thomas has been having some financial difficulties lately, and with the baby coming." Her voice trailed off, as if the words alone should explain everything. There it was. Thomas was in trouble again, and this time they had a ready-made excuse: the new baby, the one who had been planned to salvage his most recent disastrous relationship. I was done pretending to be the dutiful daughter, done pretending I didn't know exactly how this was all going to play out. "I've spent my entire life learning about this estate," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My voice was steady, calculated. I was playing the game now. I know every inch of it, every crack in the walls, every repair that needs to be made. But my father didn't let me finish. He interrupted, his tone growing sharper. "That's exactly why Thomas needs it more than you do." His words hit me like a punch. "You're already established. You have your projects. Thomas needs a fresh start. A fresh start. Fresh starts." Thomas had had more fresh starts than anyone I knew, and each one of them had failed. The cryptocurrency scheme, the restaurant venture, the yacht business. The fresh start he was getting now was just another chance to squander everything, while they continued to coddle him. I stood up slowly, my hand smoothing over the fabric of my blouse. My calm exterior was slipping, but only for a second. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice cool and controlled. "I have a meeting to get to." "Alexandra," my mother called after me, her voice tinged with frustration. "Don't be difficult about this. It's what's best for the family." I paused at the door, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. I turned back and let one small, quiet moment of satisfaction linger before speaking. "I understand completely," I replied, my voice crisp. "You're right, I do have my projects to focus on." As I walked out of the room, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. The family estate might have once been my dream, but I had something far better to focus on, something that I had built with my own hands. And it was time to show them all just how much they'd underestimated me. The words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't escape, pressing down on me with every passing second. "It's for the best, dear," my mother repeated, her voice sweet, almost patronizing, as if that somehow made the decision easier. They were offering the estate to Thomas, the one who had never cared for it, never put in the effort, the one who had always taken what was given to him without question. And yet here I was, the one who had poured every ounce of my being into building something real, something lasting, and they were dismissing it all with a few words. I felt the cold burn of disappointment spreading through me, but I kept my face carefully composed. My parents had always seen me as the independent one, the one who didn't need help, but this was different. This wasn't just about the estate. It was about them never seeing me for who I truly was, never understanding the depth of my work, the legacy I had been creating on my own. To them, I was still just their little girl, the one who played at business while they coddled Thomas, convinced that he was the one who needed rescuing. I had spent my entire life learning the ins and outs of this property, absorbing every detail like it was a part of me. The cracks in the walls, the creaks of the floors, the repairs that needed to be made. Everything about this place was etched into my memory. I had always imagined myself standing in this very room one day, proud of everything I had built, of everything I would do here. And now, all of it was being handed over to Thomas, who would undoubtedly treat it like just another one of his fleeting schemes. "You're already established," my father said, his voice growing more certain, more authoritative. "You have your projects. Thomas needs a fresh start." Fresh start? Thomas had already had more chances than anyone I knew, and each one of them had ended in failure. The cryptocurrency disaster, the failed restaurant, the yacht business that never made it past the drawing board. Those were the fresh starts he'd been given. Each time, my parents had bailed him out, smoothed over the cracks, and pretended like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I had built an empire from nothing, piece by piece. I felt my jaw tighten, my pulse quicken. The anger was rising, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I forced a smile, pretending to accept their decision with grace. "I see," I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip, trying to keep the emotion from spilling over. But the truth was, this wasn't just about the estate. It was about years of being overlooked, of having my work and my dreams reduced to something small, something unimportant. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. As I sat there, pretending to be the dutiful daughter, my mind was already spinning with the possibilities. I had spent years quietly building my own path, my own legacy. I knew exactly what I had to do next. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about showing them that I didn't need their approval, that I was capable of far more than they could ever understand. My future was mine to shape, not theirs. So, I stood up slowly, deliberately, my hand smoothing down the fabric of my blouse.